get him on for a chat. Okay. So let's do some Q&A. And again, I see a lot of it is about the death toll. I'm going to do a deeper video about that, but let's go into it. Dun, dun, dun. So FAFO law, you go, the Gaza Ministry of Health says 42,000, not 35,000. Correct. The reason I go with the lower estimate is because I want to be very, very conservative. They say 42,000. That means they have seen 42,000 different dead bodies of people who have been killed by some form of combat. Then the 34,000 number is the full ID they have. So it's bodies that they've been able to identify, name and ID numbers. The reason I go with the lower number is because people very much like to cast doubt on anything that comes out of the Gaza Ministry of Health. So they say, okay, well, how could you believe they actually saw 42,000 bodies? Well, we can't. So the 34,500 whatever names, they've showed the receipts. They've released the evidence of. Now, the way we could know, I see another question, how we can know, are these bodies combatants or civilians? Where do you get your numbers? IG asked that. So this is a great question. Well, when we break down the data of the 34,000 names that have been released, we see that around 60% are women and children, okay, and elderly. That leaves 40% men. Now, clearly not every man that was killed has been a combatant, you know. There's a 0% chance you're seeing tens of thousands of women, children, and elderly civilians being killed, but 0 men, right? So we know that some amount of these men are civilians. So how do we figure out how many are civilians? Well, let's assume that civilian men and women are dying at a similar rate. I think that's a fair assumption to make. You are then left with 80% of the list being civilians. But actually, I said it's a fair assumption to make, but I think in reality, and we have ample evidence from this, military-aged men are much more likely to be targeted. We have evidence of this from past conflicts that the majority of civilian deaths are military-aged men. And we have evidence of this in Gaza. Now, military-aged men are more likely to be killed for a few reasons. One, they're more likely to take risks, like go get food and water for their family, exposing them to, you know, the dangers. They're also often confused to be militants. We know that Hamas doesn't always wear uniform. This puts soldiers in a situation where they're often not taking chances, and they're just going to shoot military-aged men, one of them being a friend of mine, Muhammad Sharif Youssef, who's been on this channel multiple times. He was targeted with his brother in a drone strike. I can tell you for certain that they were not involved in military activity. We have many more instances of this, including whistleblowers who served in Gaza saying, let me pull up the quote. It's a pretty harrowing report, but B said that it was difficult to distinguish civilians from combatants in Gaza, claiming that members of Hamas often walk around without their weapons, but as a result, every man between the age of 16 and 50 is suspected of being a terrorist. Okay. So to say 35,000 is me being very, very conservative. When the dust settles, the number very well may be anywhere from 70 to 100,000. When you compare this to other conflicts, both the ratio of civilian to combatant and both the percentage of civilian population that's been killed proportionate to population size, it's also the highest in recent history. We're seeing nothing comparable. And when we look at things that we want to say are comparable, it's not like the world is okay with it, right? Again, I mentioned that, you know, George W. Bush is considered to be a war criminal. Assad is considered to be a war criminal. Putin is considered to be a war criminal. Okay, well, Israel, their level of proportionality is lower. The war crimes they're committing is higher. So if we want to be consistent, we would need to say that Netanyahu is a war criminal and that what's being done is horrific. Super Kripke goes, only a true naive person would conclude that Kisin was on the fence based on his interviews and anti-migrant rhetoric. Yeah, I started the stream with that. How does Hamas control Gaza's population? So what evidence do you have that Israel controls it? Luke, Luke is asking. So, I mean, you could research this. This is well established. The Palestinian population registry is within full control of Israel. Within full control of Israel. We also know from past conflicts that when the Gaza Ministry of Health releases numbers, it ultimately is confirmed by Israel. Sometimes there's debate over the civilian to combatant ratio, but their total numbers that they release is historically very accurate. In fact, the Ministry of Health has the most accurate, in time, most accurate form of reporting out of any other nation's health ministry. Now they have more experience, they have more practice. Now this doesn't mean they should be believed with everything they say. So a rule of thumb is if any government says something without showing proof, take it with a grain of salt. So for an example, we've seen many instances in the Gaza operation where there was an attack on, let's say, a school or a market, and they say 300 civilians killed. That should be taken with a grain of salt. And we've seen that those numbers are sometimes exaggerated. Again, any claim made without evidence should be taken with a grain of salt. So when Israel says 20,000 combatants have been killed, most likely that's not true. If the Gaza Ministry of Health says in this attack, we've lost 300 civilians, take that with a grain of salt. If they're going to provide the IDs and names, then we could say that they're showing the receipts. Okay, so Fafulam, I'm glad you asked this question. I forgot to mention this in my analysis. When you say that their children is that below 18 or below 16, because we know that Hamas recruits 16 and 17-year-olds. That is below 18, and actually we don't know, we don't have much evidence of child soldiers in Gaza. But one of the ways to actually make sense of this is comparing the amount of boys killed to the amount of girls, right? So when you look at the total numbers, based on the full data we have, you've had 1,400 more boys killed than girls. So you could say, you know what, out of all the children killed, maybe those 1,400 were militants. But we know that 16 and 17-year-olds, like men, are more likely to take risks and more likely to be targeted. So to think that it's possible that those 1,400 more boys that were killed because they were taking risks or because they were confused for Hamas, that's not a stretch. We don't really have much evidence of Hamas using child soldiers in any meaningful way that would change this data. But I'm glad you asked because I forgot to mention that. Mokied says, how would you conduct the situation differently? Well, let's say we are in agreement, and again, I think this is highly debatable, but let's say we're in agreement that Israel should attack Hamas. Because I think there are other approaches to deal with this that don't require a military campaign against Hamas. But let's say that's what we're doing. We should have taken a much longer time to evacuate civilians out of Gaza, right? It's one of the only conflicts that you don't, we haven't, civilians can't leave the city. And again, when I talk about how this is a worse death toll, a worse ratio, it's not entirely just the IDF intentionally trying to make this bad. There's a unique set of conditions here that also we need to take into account. Gazans can't leave. Hamas has done a great job building infrastructure underground, better than any other military or terrorist group. So it's a much harder form of urban warfare than we've seen. But that doesn't mean that doesn't absolve Israel of its responsibility to take proper precaution. So Israel very well could have given a grace period. I don't even call it a grace period, but 30 days, and worked with governments around the world to evacuate as many civilians as possible. We also could have, and I know Israelis don't like hearing this, we could have evacuated them into the Negev and give them a temporary housing solution in like a tent city. We could have evacuated them into the West Bank, or we could have done an agreement with many other countries around the world to get civilians out. Next, we could have left a lot of vital infrastructure intact. So currently, only half of the hospitals in Gaza are still operational. Now, many like to say, well, Hamas was operating out of them. Limited evidence to that claim, but let's assume that's true. Israel very well could have said, you know what, even though we see that there's Hamas activity in hospitals, we realize that what we're doing is going to cause severe harm to civilians, so let's keep all the medical infrastructure fully intact so civilians can get the proper care they need. Right? That's another one. So Moki, it says evacuating the Negev sounds like a serious security risk. Not if you're letting out primarily women and children, and you're checking everybody beforehand to see that there's no weapons. I don't think it's a major security risk if done. And if we care just a tiny bit about human life, we'll see that it's worth it. That's also an opportunity to start potentially giving them an education system that's more favorable and showing them that we're actually their friends and care about them, rather than just blowing them into smithereens, showing them further enforcing this narrative that we're the real enemy. So there's a lot of opportunity in actually letting them come into evacuating them into the negative. Another one is just a higher level of proportionality. So every day there's intel that we get. There might be military activity in some building, but we also know that there's civilians there. That's a calculation we make. How many militants are we going to kill for how many civilians? And it seems like we're acting with a low level of proportionality, meaning we are often giving the green light to attack these targets, even if we know there will be severe toll to civilian life. So increasing the level of proportionality is another thing we could do. And then you just have a situation where there's this lawlessness in Gaza. Individual soldiers are engaging in a fair bit of war crimes, from theft to execution. We're seeing mass arrests of military-aged men, and then the men are humiliated and taken photos of. We know there's massive abuses in the prison systems, and there's close to no accountability. The only time there's accountability is when something's made public, when something's made public, and then they have to do something about it. But you have a lawlessness in Gaza, and this comes from a few reasons, right? So again, countries and people respond to incentives. Israel, the only reason Israel is doing things worse than other countries is a unique set of incentives. You have a higher degree of ethnic hate between Israelis and Palestinians than you have in many other conflicts, and there's actually a cost to holding soldiers accountable. We had horrific allegations of a gang rape in Sde Teiman prison. 9 soldiers were arrested. You then had far right Israeli population. I'm not saying they're representative of the majority, but some segment of the population raided the base, the courthouse, and the prison to try to free them. So there's a political and social cost to holding soldiers accountable. So you have a high degree of ethnic hate, a lack of discipline, and a lack of accountability. That's just a recipe for disaster. Something needs to be done about that. Another one here, check out this policy that's just also shows the complete disregard for civilian life. Or at least civilian infrastructure, which does affect civilians. When the IDF stays in a home in Gaza, after they stay in the home, they burn it down. The reason they burn it down is just in case they left something there. They don't want Hamas to find it. So instead of taking 30 minutes to an hour to look through the home and make sure they didn't leave anything, they just burn it to the ground. These are homes with people's belongings, photos, who knows what else, burnt to the ground because it's just inconvenient to search it, right? That's a policy. That's not even soldiers just acting lawlessly. That's the official policy, right? So these are all things we could do differently. So if we decide that engaging Hamas militarily is the only way, okay, well, there's many things we can do differently to reduce civilian harm. And guys, I'm going to do a full report on this sometime next week, going deep into the war crimes, quotes, sources, all this stuff. And this comes from a place of love. I want to see Israel thrive. I don't hate Israel, right? What I'm saying might be similar to what a lot of the anti-Zionists or Israel haters are saying. But I don't want to see Israel destroyed as a nation. I care about Israel. My entire family lives there. I lived there half my life. But I see Israel going down a dark path. And I think these challenging conversations about what Israel is doing wrong is important to help Israel grow. For someone IG goes, for someone that served in the Israeli army, you obviously know that the code of conduct, the IDF, so it's very obvious that you're propagating false blatant lies. Time to stop. Yeah, okay. I do know the code of conduct, and the code of conduct is actually to reduce civilian harm, but I also know in practice it's often not followed. If I imagine you didn't serve in the IDF, or you're just being a propagandist. So Nick's asked, is this live? Yes, this is live. The code of conduct is to reduce civilian harm. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're guarding on a base, and somebody suspicious walks up to you. You're meant to call them, ask them to stop, right? If they don't stop, you ask them again. If they don't stop, you shoot in the air. If they don't stop, you shoot at their legs. Code of conduct, great. Tries to reduce civilian harm. In practice, it's often not followed that way, and they'll take the shot much quicker. Some units are worse than others, but there's this idea that many soldiers want to end their service with an X on their gun. And some would say that just means killing any Arab. Some would say, the more moderate units would say killing, they'd specify not an Arab, but terrorist. But this whole idea that because there's a code of conduct means that you're not going to see war crimes. No, absolutely not. The code of conduct is being disregarded in Gaza to a greater extent than we've ever seen. And again, there's a report, whistleblowers coming out of Gaza have confirmed this on many occasions. Actually, let me read you a quote about the code of conduct if I could find it. Okay, so it is forbidden to walk around. Everyone who is outside is suspicious. If we see someone in a window looking at us, he's a suspect, you shoot. That's a whistleblower that came out of Gaza. Hospitals, clinics, he continues, hospitals, clinics, schools, religious institutions, buildings of international organizations require higher authorization, but in practice, I can count on one hand where we were told not to shoot, even with sensitive things like schools. Approval just feels like a formality. Another IDF whistleblower, we destroyed everything we wanted to. This is not out of desire to destroy, but out of total indifference to everything that belongs to Palestinians. Every day, a D9 demolishes houses. I haven't taken before and after photos, but I'll never forget how a neighborhood that was really beautiful is reduced to sand. This can be confirmed by photo and video evidence as well. So, I could keep reading the quotes, but you know what? I'm doing a report on this next week. I'm going to pull out all the quotes. You accuse me of being a self-hating Israeli. No, I'm a self-critical Israeli because if we want to grow, if we want to improve, being critical is important. And yes, I served in the IDF, so I saw that the code of conduct is often different from how soldiers engage. There's no shortage of abuse, lawlessness, and often it often doesn't come from hate as much as callous indifference. Erin goes, you know the things in school in the United States, you were taught about racism. How can an American Jewish person be in such an environment like Israel knowing what they know? Well, I'm actually currently in LA, but I do spend, I'm between LA and Israel. I don't know, when the U.S. invaded Iraq and was killing 100,000 plus civilians, should I have left the United States? Like, it's more complicated than that. Just because a country does atrocious things doesn't mean you can't live there. So I'm not sure I follow that logic. Nick asks, am I a Zionist? In terms of do I support Israel's right to exist? Yes, I do. So does that make me a Zionist? If that's how you define Zionism, then yes, I am. I don't like the term Zionism. I think it's meaningless and confusing because Zionists say it's just the right to self-determination on our ancestral homeland, while anti-Zionists say it's a form of Jewish supremacy and colonialism. So we have a debate over definitions rather than the practical implications of this. I support Jewish self-determination alongside Palestinian self-determination. So if I support Jewish self-determination, that makes me a Zionist. If I support Palestinian self-determination, what does that make me? There's no special word for it. We don't need a special word for supporting one group's self-determination. So I think it's just a meaningless term. So I'd rather just explain what I actually believe, the self-determination of both our people. We need to find a way to share this land. So IG, you say you agree regarding issues with specific individuals in the army, but that's not a systemic or intentional by large. So again, I mentioned this distinction between systemic things and on an individual level. I did give an example of a policy that is systemic, that is clearly disproportionate, and that's burning down homes after soldiers stay in them. Now, The problem is that you have this this lawlessness, and you don't have accountability. So it's okay. Like every military, you're gonna have individual soldiers um, breaking ranks and doing things wrong. But if you don't have a system of accountability, you have a major problem. And sometimes it's not just individuals; it's entire units. So let me give you an example. Let me give you an example. We had three hostages. We had three hostages escape. They ran towards the Israeli army waving white flags. They were all sniped. Okay. We've heard many other reports of people waving white flags being sniped. We even have some video evidence. And people like to cast doubt. How do we know that's the IDF? How do we know that's the IDF? Well, now we have an example. The one instance where we had hostages escape, all three were killed. Shooting people waving white flags is a war crime. That same unit on October 7th executed Palestinians, and these seem to be members of Hamas, but we saw them surrender. You have drone footage. You see them get on their knees, surrender without weapons. This unit runs up to them, executes them. They then planted weapons next to them and took a photo to show that we just killed three armed terrorists. That's the same unit that killed the three hostages. So sometimes it's not just individuals. You have certain units that have this culture. Now, Omri Greenspan saying I'm a modern day Gestapo. I guess you mean Gestapo. Is that what you mean? Shame on you. But I think what you, is that what you're talking about? Shame on you. You think you're special, but you're just a traitor to your country, man. If you think that because I'm Israeli, I should therefore blindly defend Israel and refuse to call Israel out when they do something wrong, that makes you more of a Gestapo than me. That makes you the one who's acting like a Nazi. This blind support for a nation, no matter what they do. Nobody, no individual, no country deserves blind support. I want Israel to thrive. I want Israel to improve. So we need to have these challenging conversations. You could keep licking the boot of your country till the day you die. Cool. But you've done absolutely nothing to help Israel. Absolutely nothing. So, Omri, I remember you from last stream. Best ratio in modern warfare. It's actually the worst ratio in modern warfare. If you put the stream back 20 minutes, I break this down with pretty rock solid evidence. There's no evidence that it's the best ratio. There's a lot of evidence that it's the worst ratio. So you're absolutely wrong. You bought into the propaganda. You refused to criticize. Well, I actually, it makes sense. Like, why would you criticize the country if you bought into the propaganda? If you actually believe Israel has the most moral army in the world and the best ratio, and we're doing everything in our power to reduce civilian harm, why criticize it? I did the research very deeply, reached different conclusions based on an immense amount of evidence, and I'm very upset with how my country, a country I love, is acting. So yeah, I'm going to talk about it. You can't change a problem if you refuse to address it. No, Omri, we spoke about this. There's no 10 to 1. That's not the UN average. That's made up. There's no 10 to 1. Syria has 2 to 4 times as many combatants killed than civilians. Russia, Ukraine is around 1 to 1. There's been no 10 to 1 in recent history. Israel currently has the worst ratio. It's just complete bullshit. It's a completely made up stat. So you're just pushing propaganda. Basically, do some research, get an understanding. Don't just follow a few pro-Israel influencers that confirm your worldview. You're absolutely wrong. Zero basis for that whatsoever. Again, Israel killed 20,000 Hamas based on what? Based on what Israel said. So that's your evidence. Israel said so, so it must be true. Israel and Hamas both have an incentive to make things up, and they have a history in doing so. There's a long, again, I could tell you haven't done any research. If you think Israel's a reliable source, all you need to do is research the history of Israel's lies. Israel has a tremendous amount of lies from 1948 until today. Again, this is just the truth, but you haven't researched it. You want to just believe your narrative, so you're just going to repeat claims that you've heard other people say. Yeah, you should have a talk with Lonerbox. Yeah, I'd be down. I haven't really watched much of his stuff, but somebody told me that they see him as one of the most balanced voices on the conflict. So I'd love to. Is anybody in touch with him? Literally, citing the official Israeli numbers as if that's true. Omer Greenspan, Hamas is calling for their own people to martyrdom. Finally we agree. I agree with you. They are, and it's horrible. That this doesn't absolve Israel of their responsibility. Correct. Yeah, yeah. Hamas very much called us into this war. They knew exactly what they're doing. They knew how we would respond. They knew there would be tens of thousands of dead civilians and how it would isolate us internationally and potentially lead to a regional escalation. Time is not on Israel's side, my friends. Like this whole idea that we're strong and that no matter what we do, we'll survive. Guys, like let's be very honest. Time is not on our side. The Israeli economy is not doing well. We're caught up on multiple fronts. We're years away from actually defeating Hamas and replacing them with a different government. Years away. They're not really close to being defeated, like the official narrative is saying. Hezbollah is also very far from actually being defeated. Although I could actually see some mass surrender on Hezbollah's side, to be honest, because they took a lot of blows to their leadership. We don't have a way to deal with Iran. We have no way to deal with the Houthis. Our credit score has been downgraded. Our GDP did not grow this year. Those who contribute the most to the Israeli economy are leaving. 90,000 Israeli civilians are not living in their homes in the north. Tourism has gone down to zero. And our enemies can continue this for many, many years. To think that we can just fight a war on multiple fronts and still thrive as a nation, it's delusional. Guys, we need to understand that our best chance to surviving as a nation is to find a way towards peace. And to think we could just bomb the entire region to peace seems highly unlikely. Muhammad Habib is saying, I got asked to piss on my prophet's grave in Israeli DC. What is Israeli DC Discord? Is that what you mean? Recently, when I brought up Israeli crimes against Tunisia. Is that normal? I mean, that's a pretty extreme comment, but I mean, it's not so unnormal. You know, generally, and again, you know, let me be sympathetic for him because I've been very harsh on Israel, but like Israelis have been radicalized because they've been in conflict for 100 years, right? Like we're products of our environment. The reason why Palestinians and Israelis are now more radical than they've ever been is because they've been at war with each other for 100 years now. So I generally don't blame humans for doing what humans otherwise would do. I try to just focus on governments because governments, given the right pressure and change in incentives, they could change their actions, which actually has a massive trickle-down effect. So that's why I generally don't focus anger or hate towards people, not the extremists in Gaza, not the extremists in Israeli society. It's more so on the governments and what I think they could do differently. We are all products of our environment. So, Omer, you keep calling me a Gestapo, but I actually think you mean capo, right? You mean capo, right? Not Gestapo. Because Gestapo, that's... Oh, I got a call coming in. Gestapo is that's like the secret police of the Nazis. I would say you're more like Gestapo. I'd be more like a capo. Hold on, stop blowing me up. Anyways, let's see. We got some more Q&A. Look at that doggy behind me. Where? This way. You see that little dog? Little lab. Daba, and yes, you should chat to Loanerbox. I think he'd be open it. So what? Just go to his Discord and say I want to talk to you. Okay, I'm done. Someone wants to drop a link to his Discord. That would help. John Ovinsky says, does that mean you believe it's a genocide? No, I don't claim it's a genocide. I think the genocide is a legal term that is more complicated than I truly understand. But I think it requires quite a lot of evidence to say a country is committing genocide. I defer to the ICJ. They said that it's not a genocide based on their investigation. So I think anybody who's claiming it's a genocide, you're just, I guess it's a good activist term. It's sensationalist, but I like to focus on what we know is happening, and that's war crimes and crimes against humanity. We know that's happening. So it's not a genocide, but we're seeing daily war crimes being committed in Gaza that are just unacceptable. By the way, Jana, I think, Jana, you're a patron to the show, so shout out, Jana, patron. Thanks for supporting the show. If anybody else wants to support, you're welcome. You can find how to do that in the description. If anyone that's interested in peace, please let me know, and it will be great. We have Palestinians on the show that are interested in peace. They often do get backlash from their communities for doing so. So it's harder to find Palestinians. But we had Muhammad, our Gazan peace activist, who was killed in an airstrike. So, yeah. Now you know Omri's hitting me with the go live in Palestine. What? Why? Why would I go live in Palestine? So you're saying if I'm critical of the country that I love, I should go live in a different country? Okay, bro. Okay. Joshua says, you mentioned Hamas offered to release all hostages in exchange for all prisoners. What do you think a reasonable counteroffer from Israel? I mean, it's so hard at that state. We didn't have all too much leverage before entering Gaza. I think we have. It's unclear if we have more leverage now because Sinwar. It's unclear if he wants the war to end. I think he thinks time is on his side. As I mentioned, he wants a greater regional escalation. But we could have just countered and just said, we're not going to release all hostages. We'll release for every hostage, we'll release 10. No, that would actually come out to, wait, no. Yeah, we could have said 10 for one, for example. That could have been the counter, maybe meet in the middle. It could have been, we're going to do this, but we would only agree to not enter Gaza or not enter Gaza if you agree to the existence of a Jewish state next to a Palestinian state, right? We could have used it to leverage a deeper negotiation or to negotiate a 10-year truce. So, for example, few people know this, but like, and again, I'm like, the Hamas is a very, very challenging peace partner, right? Let's be clear. Like their charter in many instances says it's a little confusing because they do recognize the establishment of a Palestinian state according to 67 borders. So you're like, oh, they support two states. But then in other areas, what they do is they call for the continual resistance until the entire land is liberated, right? So they're still not on board with the existence of Israel. But after they got elected, they reached out to Israel for a 10-year truce. And again, not the most favorable terms, but Israel didn't counter. They didn't say, you know, a 10-year truce would be great. Let's see if we could find a way to do this. And a 10-year truce could then lead to a 20-year truce and potentially even peace over time. Instead, what we did was we said, we don't negotiate with terrorists. There's no truce. We're putting Gaza under siege. And, you know, here we are today. So they used to be up for an extended truce period. But yeah, there's many things we could have countered. At the very least, just not needing to release as many prisoners. Muhammad says, do you think in 100 years it can be one state for all people? Yeah, in around 100 years or so. I don't think it could be like the first step. I think that would be a disaster. There's too much fear, hate, and mistrust for us to be living in one state, unless it's a federation and there's a sophisticated system of checks and balances and we're not competing over demographic and political control. Then yes. If we're talking about just like one state in the democratic system we currently have, it would take a few generations of healing. Nix goes, Hamas, for example, would never admit to a stray rocket hitting their own people, while Israel did admit it and killed the 3 hostages. Israel admits things when they don't have a choice. So the second a unit killed 3 of their own, it's not going to be kept secret because people in the unit talk. It's not something they're just going to hide. It was horrific, and they all felt very guilty about it. So they had to acknowledge that it happened. When you're killing a Gazan civilian, it's like there's going to be this agreement amongst the unit, and we're just not going to tell anybody that this happened. That's generally how it goes. And because there's also backlash to call out, anybody who says, I was in Gaza and I saw people shooting civilians, there's immense backlash. That's why generally the whistleblowers come out anonymously, and we do have a report of, I think it's 6 whistleblowers in Gaza, all confirming pretty horrific things. Fafo, Fafo saying, Adar, where did you get the ratio of the Syrian war? I'm looking at 2000, and it says civilians have been killed. I'm seeing more updated reports. Let me send you a link. You're welcome to send that link. I will look at it as well. But this one does this one is the most thorough breakdown, and it's somebody who is anti-Assad. So I'm not going to use a pro-Assad source, right? They're obviously going to make it seem like not many civilians have been killed. So I'm intentionally going with a pro-Western source to make this case, a pro-Western anti-Assad source, and it's quite thorough. But happy for more information. So Tikkun Olam says peace with Nazis happened only after the Second World War when they stopped being Nazis. Yeah, that's one example when we did have to destroy a country in order to topple the government, but you have many instances of terror organizations becoming legitimate governments. Israeli government being one of them, the PLO being another, the IRA being another, South Africa also. Many, many instances of terror organizations reforming over time given the right conditions. Omer's asking me if I love Israel. I do love Israel in many ways. It's given me so much in this life. My family lives there. Many of them require Israel for their safety, meaning they know no other home. But I'm very troubled with the path Israel is going down, and there are many also aspects of Israel that I'm concerned about, and some I certainly do not love. You could even say hate. Hamas official has offered to surrender weapons to a third party and become solely a political party. The fact that they totally... John, when was that? Can you send me information on that? That's interesting. See if Arabs would... It's hard to enforce if that's the deal they made, but I'd be interested in seeing it. Muhammad says, Ziv, responding to what Ziv wrote, Arabs would literally accept you if you stopped the occupation of the West Bank and stopped killing people. Yeah, but there's still this... Like a lot of people say, yeah, the solution's simple: end the occupation, make everybody a citizen, it'll all be good. I'm not at all convinced. I think there's a lot of still deep-rooted hate, pain. There's a desire for retribution. Corey Gill-Schuster has a channel called The Ask Project. Awesome channel. He'll go around asking Israelis and Palestinians different things. One of the questions was asking, said, if Palestine is liberated, can Jews remain in the land? And very few said, yeah, we could live here as equals. They either said, no, they need to leave, or others said, yes, they could live here, but as second-class citizens or as guests. And when you look at polling, the amount of Palestinians that support a binational state, like many Western activists are proposing, it's in like the single digits or low double digits. Very few Palestinians support a secular democratic, a binational state. They want a Palestinian state that either Jews would need to leave or they can't be equals in. I mean, this is consistent polling. Now, yeah, you change the environmental conditions, you change the sentiment, but to think that step one could be to just, we're all citizens, we're all equal, all living together, and it won't end in disaster, I'm not at all convinced. Maybe it will, but that's an awfully big risk you're asking Israelis to take. You're asking them to potentially get genocided and ethnic cleansed by supporting this plan. So I don't know why they would get behind something like that. So John goes, they did it in exchange for a Palestinian state along 67 border. Okay, that's interesting. Mokit says, I don't think the issue is an exchange deal. The issue is that Israelis don't want Hamas in Gaza, and Hamas knows that, so they won't give up their leverage. Yeah, that is true, right? Israel is willing to give back prisoners. It's the leaving Hamas in power that they're not agreeing to. Most Israelis, though, do now support that. The majority of Israelis support ending the war to get the hostages back, which means Hamas would remain in power. The government currently does not support that, or at least the main decision makers in the government don't support that. Luke is saying Hamas is not a peace partner. What are you talking about? The PA is barely a peace partner. Hamas today is not a peace partner, but they could be in the future. The only constant is change. You change the pressures, you change the incentives, you change the people. Countless examples of this throughout history. We've seen Hamas used to be more moderate than the PLO, right? We saw them as the more moderate faction, and the PLO reformed into the PA. And then the PA recognized Israel's right to exist in 1989. Israel has made a grave mistake by rewarding terrorists. So, for example, when there was violence in Gaza, we pulled out. But when the PA works with us to maintain security in the West Bank, all we do is expand settlements, increase the checkpoints in order to keep those settlements safe. So what we did was the past 20 or so years, we rewarded extremists and penalized the moderates, which just pushes the Palestinians to support more extremism. Go live in Palestine. See how they take good care of Jews like you and me. What point are you trying to make? You know, like, I don't get what point you're trying to make, Omri. You're just like regurgitating this typical Hasbara that is shallow, not thought through, not intellectual, inaccurate. It's like, cool, okay, go live in Palestine. Dun, dun, dun. Omri goes, go sip your coffee in Tel Aviv, wimp. Okay, bro. Okay, bro. I actually think it requires a lot more courage to speak against a nation you love despite the backlash rather than just be an obedient bootlicker. So who's the wimp? You're the one that would bend over and get pegged in the ass by Israel if they asked you. Not me. I didn't realize how far down these comments are going crazy. I'm a little back. I don't think it would make sense to compare ratio between Israel as people compared between. Yeah, well, I'm okay. I agree. It's an entirely unique situation, so it's hard to make comparisons. But I'm pushing back on people that are making blatant lies that it's the best ratio and that Israel is acting in a way that no other country has acted. So that's me pushing back on these blatantly false claims. And I take it as a Jew, I take it personally. We know better than anybody what atrocity denialism looks like. It's done about the Holocaust. They're doing it on October 7th. They're denying our atrocities. We know the pain that comes with that. So I'm extra triggered when I see Jews doing this to another population. We should be the most sensitive towards denying other people's atrocities because we know what that feels like. Joseph says, part of me feels that making concessions to return hostages only incentivizes Hamas to keep taking them. That's actually true, right? And then that's an important point. So this strengthens the argument that we shouldn't do a deal, let the hostages die in Gaza, let's just keep fighting. The question is, what is really the cost? The cost is letting the hostages die. And again, if you had a family member there, you'd probably feel pretty differently about you'd probably be pretty upset with the idea of just letting them die or stay in captivity for who knows how long and who knows what conditions. But it's also a question of what is the cost of defeating Hamas? What is the cost? Like, how many of our own soldiers do we need to sacrifice? What is the cost to our economy? What is the cost to the civilian life in Gaza? What is the cost to our reputation globally, right? So when we start to weigh this out, even if this does incentivize them to do it again, it's unclear that the alternative is a better decision. Now, the best way to avoid them from taking more hostages is just a better security system. October 7th was their success, but it was really our failure. It was a massive military failure. We need to ensure that that could never happen again, even if Hamas is still in power. So we could avoid something like this happening with the right security apparatus in place. Mokied says, Adar, I think when Israelis say they support to stop the war for getting the hostages back, they think that means they can continue afterwards, not agreeing to leave Hamas in power. Honestly, that's possible. It means that they just don't understand the terms of the agreement that they're supporting, because it would essentially stop them. I don't know how you could actually stop them. There'd just be some repercussions from the international community, but I'd say that's possible. We would need polling on that to actually know, though. Fahed goes, as a Palestinian, I would take a dart to try our shawarma. Well, you know, so Fahed, friend from Gaza, good to see you here. Did you guys know that shawarma in Gaza, pre-October 7th, prices there are outrageous now, but shawarma, which is that meat skewer, you know, the circle meat, it's often turkey, sometimes chicken, sometimes beef and lamb. Well, at least in Israel. In Israel, prices are outrageous, but you get it in a pita. It's like 30, 35 shekels these days. It used to be less, but these are prices now. In Gaza, it's 2 shekels. That's crazy. Now, this is wild. You know how they have like Mexican food? They have al pastor, which is also the circling meat. It's just pork. Do you know where that came from? That came from Palestinian refugees that moved to South America after 48. They brought this notion of rotating meat. Latinos preferred pork, or that's what they had accessible. But that's where it comes from. Isn't that wild? You can fact check me on that, though, because I heard it and believed it. It's possible it's just one of those folklores that isn't true, but sounds believable. Okay, we have some comments from Facebook. Yeah, for those who don't know, this is streamed to Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, and Twitch. We don't get many viewers, but we do have one Facebook viewer right now. One! And he's commenting. In all caps lock. Let me pull this up. This is a wild. Blessed are the inhabitants of the land of Israel when they are persecuted because they live next to God, the Father, who is true and living. Blessed are those who live in Israel because they can easily listen to the Lord Jesus Christ. Blessed are the inhabitants of Israel because they can earn salvation easily. The power of God, the Father, is endless. Triple trillion of Big Bang Theory. At first, I thought this was just some Christian shit. Then I thought it's we're just going off the rocker now, my guy. ASDF says you should really host more debates and interviews with popular speakers. Now it's time to grow your platform. I agree. I'm finally freeing up time to it, so I think we're going to see a lot more content and an explosion of viewers and content in the next few months. So I hope so. We have to get Israelis and Palestinians to actually know each other, even though it's hard and sometimes even dangerous. Agreed, Shachal. I don't know the numbers, but people generally underestimate the number of Israelis against the occupation and the killings. I know from that side. No, actually, I'm not willing. So Lucky King says, are you willing to accept the fact that maybe Hamas will never change their mind no matter what? Oh, maybe? Yeah, I'm willing to accept that. I recognize that when I say that I think that given the right incentives and pressures, Hamas can reform, I recognize that I might be wrong. I want to be clear about that. But I think that until we make a true valiant effort to try to do that, to just do the wholesale destruction of Gaza and see so many civilians killed without any clear plan to defeat Hamas and replace them, it's hard for me to support so much death and destruction when we haven't tried means that are much less destructive. So no, I agree there might not be a way But I'm fairly confident that there is a path. It might not be easy, but I think it's possible. Gershon Baskin, Bill Lesher goes, Gershon Baskin said the Hamas told him they're willing to give up power to third party for a ceasefire. That's interesting. Yeah, I wonder how you just enforce it, but yeah. Oh, whoops, I got it wrong. Fahed goes, yeah, Peter, it was 7 to 8 shekels. 2 shekels is for falafel. Okay. Might be. That's still a great price. Ari Joseph goes, tacos El Pastor is Lebanese, not Palestinian. Thanks for that clarification. Are you worried about speaking out and getting your Israeli citizens revoked? They have been known to do that. Aaron, I'm not sure they've been known to do that. No, I don't have a fear of that happening, and I'm not sure they're doing it. I do know that Israelis who are speaking out against showing sympathy for Gazan civilians have been arrested, which is completely fucked up. I mean, that's some authoritarian bullshit, right? But no, I don't know if citizenships are getting revoked. Michael Newman. Okay, we're going to end this, but Michael Newman's asking what I propose when it comes to what, like a solution? Are you talking about like an actual solution to the conflict, Gaza specifically? Let's talk grander solution. I think, first of all, Israel has the power to enact change. We control the borders. We are the more powerful entity. We're the de facto ruler of the land. Yeah, you have pockets within, from the river to the sea, that are not controlled by us, but by and large, we hold most of the power. I think one thing we could do is really present a path to a two-state solution that would require compromise from both sides, that give Palestinians hope, but they would need to essentially, it wouldn't be unilateral. They would need to come with certain concessions, like recognizing Israel's right to exist, denouncing violence, et cetera, right? So give them this plan towards peace and working towards it. One of the reasons we've seen a radicalization of Palestinians the past few decades is because they've entirely lost hope. When you don't have hope, you fall into despair, you become radicalized. So one is to just, be dedicated towards trying to find a way towards a two-state solution. We were pretty close at times during Oslo. And at that point, like, it's important to point out, 50% of Palestinians supported two states, meaning you had a point in time where 50% of Palestinians supported Israel's right to exist. That's now in the 20s. But given the right conditions, you could get that well beyond 50%. But I also hear the case that two-state solution is not so viable anymore with the amount of settlers you have, with the fact that most Israelis and Palestinians don't support it, and the more energized populations in our societies don't support two states. Maybe we keep the land whole. We do one state, but not just like one binational state from the river to the sea. We turn it, well, essentially that, but not in the traditional sense. It becomes a federation. So it's essentially like the 20-state solution. You turn the land of Israel and Palestine into many smaller states or cantons. Each one has a lot more local autonomy. You could then have, let's say, two parliaments, an Israeli parliament, a Palestinian parliament. You could have one shared parliament that needs to be 50-50. You need a system of checks and balances so there's not competition over political and demographic control. But a federation solution might be the sophisticated solution we need for such a complicated issue. So I consider myself solution agnostic in the sense that I'm not super tied to one solution. It just needs to provide the needs of both people. So Palestinians, they want freedom. They want a sense of justice. We Jewish Israelis want to feel safe. Any solution that could provide that to our people and seems viable, I would get behind. But Israel has the power to start to build and propose these plans in a way that can inspire hope amongst Palestinians. We need to return to the negotiating table and work with the international community. We should also feel a little more confident. The fact that we now have normalized ties with the UAE, Morocco, and Bahrain. We're on relatively good terms with Jordan and Egypt, right? There's like, we're in a position where we could build this Middle Eastern coalition to put ample pressure on both sides to make the concessions needed. So I think there is an actual opportunity for peace, seeing the changes we've seen in the Middle East. China also wants to get more involved. I don't know if that's good or bad, but China seems to want to get their finger in the pot, in the honey pot. Did you all know? This didn't make so much news, but a few months ago, all representatives from all the Palestinian factions, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Palestinian Authority, I think even some of the smaller factions, they all went to China for a meeting. And made a deal. It was like a $50 billion deal to rebuild Gaza. But one of the terms was that they cannot commit war crimes. Is that interesting? So China is trying to get involved by helping rebuild Gaza, but they're trying to do it in a way that keeps the Palestinian factions in line. That's interesting. Can it be enforced? Will there be repercussions if it's not? I'm not sure, but it's still worth noting. Muhammad says, but why would Israel do that, being backed blindly by the U.S. and having infinite military superiority? That is a great point. We have a problem with incentives. It's very hard to hold Israel accountable for their actions. So why would they make any concessions? I agree. I think the U.S. needs to put a lot more pressure on Israel. I think the funding Israel gets from the U.S. should be conditional on meeting certain terms. I'm with you on that. Fafo says, what are your thoughts on UNRWA? Do you think it'd be better if the UNHCR handled this situation? I'm not well informed enough about that. I do, based on what I've seen, UNRWA has actually done a lot of good, but there's also some bad, like the education system. We do know some members of UNRWA were also Hamas. Now, that's something actually interesting. That actually doesn't say all too much about UNRWA, right? So let me give you an example. You can't control every employee you have in an organization. So, for example, if we know that the U.S. military, some people in the military have been involved in smuggling drugs. We know this was happening with heroin from Vietnam. Does that mean, oh, the U.S. You see, the U.S. supports the drug trade, right? That's not the right conclusion to reach. But interestingly, when we find out some members of UNRWA or Hamas, we're like, you see, the UN brought in terrorists. I think that's probably not the right conclusion to reach. That said, I'm not an expert on them. I would, based on what I've seen, they're far from perfect, but I think they've also done some good work. A friend of mine explained it this way: Israelis fight for survival while Palestinians fight for land. There's certainly truth to that framing. If you get to the bottom core of what we're fighting for, there's many different things, right? Many Israelis want to expand the land for religious and ideological reasons. But if you really get to the core of what the majority of Israelis want, it's really rooted in security. When you look at Palestinians, it's more so this sense of justice, feeling like they got justice and they're no longer being humiliated. So yeah, like that framing can certainly lead people to the more pro-Israel side of things. But it's not, that's looking at like what drives us is not the only way to judge a conflict. There's who has the power, how are we wielding that power. So that's why if you actually look at this objectively, you're going to reach the conclusion that there's certain areas where Israel is way more justified than Palestine, and other areas where they're just way worse. I think that's an intellectually honest conclusion you would reach if you really put your biases aside. Don't get emotional over it and just look at this objectively. I wish Konstantin did that, but it doesn't seem like he was able to. But yeah, there's definitely credit where credit's due. We're just not just credit, just like some sides are operating from a better place when it comes to one aspect of the conflict and from a worse place in the other part of the conflict. Okay, I think we're gonna wrap this up. So people can somebody give me background? I'm gonna reach out to Loanerbox. He said you think he'd be interested in talking about the numbers. What conclusion did you reach? Just so I could have a little bit of background on what he's saying. Muhammad goes, Adar, how is it possible to support a Jewish state for the current Jewish population there without necessitating the occupation of Palestinians and denying them a right of return? Well, I think that if you have a right of return, it still needs to be within certain limits of how much a nation can, how many new immigrants a nation could absorb every year. So I could see a situation where even in 2 states, Israel has a policy that they let descendants of those who were living on these lands prior to 48 return, but they say reasonably we could only absorb 60,000 people a year. So we'll let in 30,000 Jews, 30,000 Palestinians. As long as these Palestinians don't pose a threat, security threat, they're not posing a demographic threat because it's very much in line with how many Jewish immigrants are coming in. I actually think that's a way to frame right of return that could potentially work and get Jewish Israelis to buy into it. This whole idea that you could just like right of return, 1 million people can come in a year. I mean, a country can't absorb that many people. There's not only a security risk, there's economic concerns. So there needs to be some reasonable immigration rate. Dun, dun, dun. So, okay, we're going to wrap it up. What do you all think, though? Right? So this has gone on for an hour and a half, but the Konstantin debunking was only 33 minutes. Now, if somebody wants to watch the debunking, they might be intimidated by an hour and a half. So to me, it makes sense that once the stream is over, I cut out this past hour and upload it separately. I'm just wondering what to call it to make it intriguing, Suggestions, chat. What do you think we do it? What do y'all think? Okay, I'll think about it. But yeah, I think I'm going to cut it up. This will be uploaded separately. Anyways, thank you all for joining. We'll do another thing next week, really going deep into sorry, I can't log off now. Y'all gave me more. These are some good suggestions. Fahed goes in Israeli debunking Zionist lies. We're talking about titles. Shachar goes Isadora Capo. Okay, I like that. I mean, title just needs to be clickbaity, right? In Israeli debunking Zionist lies. Honestly, that might be the clickbait we need. That might be the clickbait we need. Thank you, Fahed. And guys, just look how beautiful this is, right? Let's talk about something for a moment. There's a lot of content, Israel-Palestine content. But just look at our comment section. We have Fahed from Gaza, Shachar from Israel, Mokied Fafalo. I think you're Israeli or on the pro-Israel side, but we have a nice mix. We have Muhammad Suwan, we have Muhammad Jawadi, and we're all getting along relatively well, right? So it's just we're proving what's possible. We don't need to agree. Yeah, and then sometimes we get an Omer Greenspan in here, but I think we're really building something beautiful. Our ability to talk about this complicated issue in a way that's nuanced. So thank you all for everybody who joined in the comments and added perspective, asked questions, and just made this stream all the more better. Thank you all so much. Yeah, shout out also to Nomad, Nix2525, Yana Vinsky. Sending love to you all, and I will see you again next week.